My name is Margaret and I'm 70 years old. I live in a quiet little town in the English countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and a garden that's been my sanctuary for years. This is the story of how, in the most unexpected of places, I found love again, and how it changed my life in ways I never imagined. I never thought I'd feel this way again, not at 70. After losing my husband 10 years ago, I had resigned myself to a quiet, predictable life. My days were filled with routines. Mornings spent tending to my garden, afternoons reading novels, and evenings watching the same old shows on television. My children visited occasionally, and while I loved them dearly, their lives were busy, and I didn't want to burden them with my loneliness. I told myself I was content, that I had lived a full life and didn't need anything more. But deep down I knew something was missing. I missed the companionship, the laughter, and the simple joy of sharing my life with someone. Still, I had convinced myself that those days were behind me. Love, I thought, was for the young, or at least for those who hadn't already had their chance. The only time I ventured out was for my regular hospital checkups. I had a heart condition that required monitoring, and while I didn't particularly enjoy the visits, they gave me a reason to leave the house. The hospital had become a strange sort of comfort to me, a place where I was surrounded by people even if I didn't know them. It was on one of these visits that I first met Robert. I remember the day clearly. It was a crisp autumn morning and the hospital was bustling with activity. I was sitting in the waiting room flipping through an old magazine when I noticed him. He was helping an elderly woman into a wheelchair, his movements gentle and deliberate. He had a kind face, with soft lines around his eyes that hinted at a life well lived. His name tag read Robert, and I couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here. He didn't look like a doctor or a nurse, and he wasn't wearing the uniform of the hospital's staff. Our first interaction was brief. He noticed me struggling to find the cardiology department and offered to guide me there. "You look like you've been here before," he said with a warm smile. "But this place is a maze, isn't it?" I laughed politely, grateful for his help but not thinking much of it at the time. Still, something about his presence lingered with me long after I left that day. There was a warmth to him, a kindness that felt genuine in a way I hadn't encountered in years. Over the next few months I began to notice him more often. He was always there, helping patients, chatting with the nurses, or simply offering a kind word to anyone who needed it. One day as I sat in the waiting room, he came over and handed me a cup of tea. "You look like you could use this," he said, his eyes twinkling with a kindness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. We started talking first about small things, the weather, the hospital garden, the books we were reading. But as the weeks went by, our conversations grew deeper. I learned that he was 60, a retired teacher who had taken up volunteering after losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago. He spoke about her with such love and respect that it brought tears to my eyes. I shared my own story about my husband and the life we had built together, and for the first time in years I felt truly understood. Our friendship grew quickly and soon I found myself looking forward to my hospital visits, not because of the doctors or the tests but because of him. One day he surprised me by asking if I'd like to join him for a walk in the hospital garden after my appointment. I hesitated at first, unsure if it was appropriate, but the look in his eyes convinced me to say yes. That walk turned into many more, and before I knew it, we were meeting outside the hospital as well. We went to a local botanical garden, where he showed me his favorite flowers and told me stories about his childhood. We attended a book reading at the library, where we discovered a shared love for poetry. He even came over to my house one afternoon to help me with my garden, and we spent hours planting tulips and laughing like old friends. But as much as I enjoyed his company, I couldn't ignore the doubts that crept into my mind. Was it right for me to feel this way at my age? What would my children think? And what if I opened my heart again only to lose him too? These fears kept me awake at night, and for a while I considered pulling away. I told myself that it was better to be alone than to risk the pain of loss again. But then something happened that changed everything. During one of my checkups, the doctor found an irregularity in my heart rhythm and recommended that I stay overnight for observation. It wasn't serious, but it was enough to scare me. When Robert found out, he came to see me immediately. He sat by my bedside holding my hand and telling me stories to keep my spirits up. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "And you're not alone." His words stayed with me, and in that moment I realized how much he meant to me. After I was discharged, I invited him over for tea and we had a long, heartfelt conversation. I told him about my fears, about how I wasn't sure if I could open my heart again. He listened patiently, then took my hand in his. "Life is too short to let fear hold us back," he said. "We've both lost people we loved, but that doesn't mean we can't find happiness again." His words gave me the courage I needed to take a leap of faith. From that day on, we decided to embrace whatever time we had together without worrying about what others might think. Our relationship blossomed in ways I never imagined. We spent our days exploring new places, trying new things, and simply enjoying each other's company. He brought a light into my life that I hadn't realized was missing, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. My children were surprised at first, but when they saw how happy I was, they welcomed Robert into the family with open arms. Looking back, I never would have thought that a routine hospital visit could lead to something so beautiful. Robert taught me that it's never too late to find love, that even in the twilight of our lives, we can still discover new beginnings. As I sit here now watching him tend to the tulips in our garden, I can't help but smile. Life may not have turned out the way I expected, but in many ways it's even better. And for that I am endlessly grateful. The days with Robert felt like a second chance at life. It wasn't just the companionship that made it special. It was the way he made me feel seen, valued, and alive. He had a way of bringing out the best in me, of reminding me of the person I used to be before grief had dulled my spirit. I found myself laughing more, smiling at little things, and even humming while I worked in the garden. It was as though he had reignited a spark in me that I thought had long since burned out. But as much as I cherished our time together, I couldn't ignore the whispers of doubt that lingered in the back of my mind. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I decided to voice my concerns. "Robert," I began hesitantly, "do you ever feel guilty? About moving on, I mean. About finding happiness again?" He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "I used to," he admitted. "When my wife passed, I thought I'd never love anyone else. I felt like even the idea of it would be a betrayal. But over time I realized that love doesn't diminish, it grows. Loving you doesn't mean I love her any less. It just means my heart has found room for both." His words brought tears to my eyes. I had spent so long feeling as though my love for my late husband was a barrier to moving forward, but Robert made me see it differently. Love wasn't a finite resource. It was infinite, capable of expanding and evolving in ways I hadn't imagined. Still, the road wasn't without its challenges. My children, while supportive, had their reservations. My daughter, Emily, was the first to voice her concerns. "Mom, are you sure about this?" she asked one afternoon as we sat in my kitchen. "I mean, he seems like a nice man, but what if it doesn't work out? What if you get hurt?" Her words stung, but I knew they came from a place of love. "Emily," I said gently, "I know you're worried about me, but I can't live my life in fear of what might happen. Robert makes me happy, and at my age, happiness is something I can't take for granted." She nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. It wasn't until she met Robert that her doubts began to fade. He had a way of winning people over with his warmth and sincerity, and before long, Emily was laughing at his jokes and asking him about his favorite books. Seeing them connect filled me with a sense of relief and gratitude. It was as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. As our relationship deepened, Robert and I began to talk about the future. It was a strange and bittersweet conversation, filled with both hope and the acknowledgement of our mortality. "We don't have decades ahead of us," he said one evening as we sat by the fire. "But that just means we have to make the most of the time we do have." His words stayed with me, and I found myself cherishing every moment we spent together. We took day trips to the countryside, visited art galleries, and even tried our hand at cooking classes. One particularly memorable evening, we attempted to make homemade pasta. The kitchen was a disaster. Flour everywhere, dough sticking to the counter, but we couldn't stop laughing. By the end of the night, we were covered in flour and the pasta was barely edible, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the joy we found in each other's company. But life, as always, had its ups and downs. One afternoon, as we strolled through the park, Robert suddenly stopped and clutched his chest. Panic surged through me as I helped him sit down on a nearby bench. "It's just a little tightness," he said, trying to reassure me, but I wasn't convinced. We went to the hospital, where the doctors confirmed that he had experienced a mild angina attack. The news was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, and it shook me to my core. That night, as I sat by his hospital bed, I couldn't hold back my tears. "I can't lose you, Robert," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't think I could survive it." He reached for my hand, his grip weak but steady. "Margaret," he said softly, "none of us know how much time we have. But I'd rather spend a short time truly living with you than a lifetime just existing." His words were both comforting and heartbreaking. They reminded me of the risks we take when we open our hearts, but they also reminded me of the rewards. Love, I realized, wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about embracing life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. After Robert's health scare, we became even more determined to make the most of our time together. We started a tradition of writing letters to each other, a habit that quickly became one of my favorite parts of our relationship. Every week we would exchange letters, pouring our thoughts, feelings, and memories onto the page. It was a way of capturing the essence of our love, of creating something tangible that would endure even if we didn't. One of his letters, in particular, stayed with me. In it he wrote, "Margaret, you've taught me that love isn't about age or circumstance. It's about connection. You've given me a reason to wake up each morning with a smile on my face, and for that I will always be grateful. No matter what the future holds, know that you've made my life richer, fuller, and more beautiful than I ever thought possible." Reading his words brought tears to my eyes. I kept that letter in my bedside drawer, and on difficult days I would take it out and read it, letting his words remind me of the love we shared. As the months turned into years, our bond only grew stronger. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries together, each one a testament to the life we had built. We faced challenges, of course, health scares, moments of doubt, and the occasional disagreement, but through it all we remained steadfast in our commitment to each other. One particularly memorable moment came on our second anniversary. Robert surprised me with a trip to the seaside, a place I hadn't visited since my children were young. As we walked along the shore, the salty breeze tangling my hair, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," I said, turning to him. "For everything." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You don't have to thank me, Margaret. Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." The seaside trip marked a turning point in our relationship. It wasn't just a celebration of the time we had spent together. It was a reminder of how far we had come. As we walked along the shore, hand in hand, I realized how much Robert had changed my life. He had brought color back into a world that had once felt gray, and for that I was endlessly grateful. But life, as always, had its challenges. A few months after our trip, Robert's health began to decline. It started with small things: shortness of breath, fatigue, and occasional chest pain. At first he brushed it off, insisting that he was fine, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I urged him to see a doctor, and after much persuasion he finally agreed. The diagnosis was sobering. His heart was weakening, and while there were treatments available, there was no cure. The news hit me like a tidal wave. I had always known that our time together was finite, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms was devastating. That night, as we sat together in his living room, I couldn't hold back my tears. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered, my voice trembling. He took my hand in his grip steady despite the fear I knew he must have been feeling. "Margaret," he said softly, "we've always known that life is unpredictable. But that's what makes it so precious. We can't control how much time we have, but we can control how we spend it. And I want to spend every moment I have left with you." His words gave me strength, and from that day on we made a pact to live each day to the fullest. We created a bucket list, not of grand, extravagant adventures, but of simple, meaningful experiences. We wanted to focus on the things that truly mattered: spending time with loved ones, revisiting cherished memories, and creating new ones. One of the first items on our list was to visit the botanical garden where we had shared one of our first outings. As we walked through the vibrant displays of flowers, I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia. Do you remember the first time we came here? I asked, smiling at the memory. He chuckled. How could I forget? You spent half the time correcting my flower names. I laughed, the sound light and carefree. Well, someone had to set you straight. You were calling tulips roses. He grinned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. I did it on purpose, you know. I wanted an excuse to keep talking to you. His confession caught me off guard and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. Even after all this time, he still had a way of making me feel like a young woman in love. As the months went by, Robert's health continued to decline, but his spirit remained unshaken. He faced each day with a quiet strength that inspired everyone around him. Even on his worst days, he found ways to make me smile, whether it was by telling a silly joke or reminiscing about our shared memories. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, he turned to me with a serious expression. Margaret, he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, there's something I need to say. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I nodded, urging him to continue. I want you to promise me something, he said. When the time comes, I don't want you to stop living. I don't want you to retreat into yourself or let grief consume you. I want you to keep going, to keep finding joy in the little things. Promise me that you'll keep living, Margaret. Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. I promise, I whispered, my voice breaking. But only if you promise me the same. He smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Deal. That conversation stayed with me, and in the weeks that followed I found myself clinging to the moments we shared. Every laugh, every touch, every quiet moment of companionship felt like a gift. I knew that our time together was limited, but I was determined to make the most of it. One of the most memorable days we shared was a picnic in the park. It was a warm spring afternoon, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. We spread out a blanket under a large oak tree and spent hours talking, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. At one point, Robert pulled out a small notebook and handed it to me. What's this? Asked, curious. It's for you, he said. I've been writing down my thoughts, memories, and little messages for you. I wanted to leave you something to hold on to, something to remind you of how much you mean to me. I opened the notebook, my hands trembling, and began to read. Each page was filled with his handwriting, a mix of heartfelt reflections, funny anecdotes, and words of love. It was the most beautiful gift I had ever received, and I knew I would treasure it for the rest of my life. When the end finally came, it was both heartbreaking and peaceful. Robert passed away on a quiet summer morning, surrounded by his loved ones. I held his hand until the very end, whispering words of love and gratitude. Even in his final moments, he managed to smile, his eyes filled with the same warmth that had drawn me to him all those years ago. In the days that followed, I found myself overwhelmed by grief, but also by a profound sense of gratitude. Robert had given me a gift that few people ever receive: a second chance at love. He had shown me that it was never too late to find happiness, that even in the face of loss, life could still be beautiful. I kept my promise to him. I continued to live, to find joy in the little things, and to cherish the memories we had created together. I spent my days tending to the garden we had planted, reading the letters he had written, and sharing our story with anyone who would listen. His love had left an indelible mark on my heart, and I knew that it would stay with me for the rest of my life. As I sit here now writing this story, I can't help but smile. Robert may be gone, but his love lives on, in my memories, in the lessons he taught me, and in the way he changed my life. He showed me that love isn't bound by age or circumstance, that it's never too late to open your heart and take a chance. And for that, I will always be grateful. If you enjoyed my story and believe in the beauty of second chances, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Second Chance Tales. Here we share heartfelt stories of love, hope, and new beginnings, because it's never too late to start a new chapter. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.